Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I thank my longtime friends here at Sheffield and SPERI for the invitation. Kind generosity. We're actually, Professor Wang Yong and I are here for actually about 2 weeks. And so we're very happy to be here. Also very happy to be on the panel with my longtime friend Wang Yong and with John and Matthew. Both Wang Yong today, this morning, and John O'Neill's presentation yesterday really do a nice job of setting the terrain for discussion for me today. And so BRICS Development Bank is something that I've been working on for a little while now, and the question of rising states, rising powers, shifting global order, this kind of question, something I've been thinking about for a little while. And what I've tried to do, though, for this presentation this morning is really mold it to what I think is the spirit of this conference, to get at questions of the global distribution of power, growth, and development, coming out of the crisis, looking at other contexts beyond the advanced industrial world or developed world. And so I'm going to really try to mold my presentation today around that window through which to analyze some of the trends that I've been looking at with regards to the BRICS Development Bank. So just to remind myself, SPERI 2014, the conference seeks to take the discussion of political economy of the crisis beyond its British-European context, focus centrally on the dynamics and patterns of the distribution of growth and development across the entire global political economy. What I'd like to propose is two main points today. One, that the proposed BRICS Bank, right, it's still proposed, it hasn't been launched formally yet. It's been in discussion for a couple of years now. I probably will see a breakthrough coming in the next month. That's what we've been hearing about this upcoming Brazilian BRICS summit. That the BRICS Bank sheds light on China's structural location and strategic positioning amid the emerging contours of global power and global distribution of growth and development. And when we look at it at this BRICS Development Bank, so this emerging contours part I think is important. What's the shape of things, kind of coming out of 08, 09? The second point is the BRICS is obviously not just a story of cooperation, but also contestation between the BRICS as well. There is some interstate rivalry, so I'm not going to try to paper over those things, and I'll try to touch on how this dynamic of cooperation and competition or contestation plays out between these rising states in the system. But the second point also is this idea of what has been the impact of the 2008-09 global financial crisis on the collective action, as well as, especially on the collective action side, for China and the other rising states. And so these are the two kind of main points that I'd like to hopefully run through my presentation. So the first point is that I think what's interesting about the BRICS Development Bank, and just for basics, for those who don't follow this stuff daily, the BRICS Development Bank, so BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they've been talking since about 2011, 2012 at the Delhi Summit about creating this BRICS Development Bank. There's still a lot of things to decide about who the bank will lend to, and who's in, who's out, and how much money exactly, the staffing, and the location of the headquarters. So they have to work out a number of things that are both pretty serious and symbolic. And so, so you can imagine there's a lot of debate. They finally agreed last year to make a 10 billion initial contribution each, so 50 billion startup fund. My understanding is that in Brazil, at the upcoming meeting in the next month, they will move actually up to 100 billion. My understanding is China originally wanted to start at 100 billion, but as you'll see in the discussion, for China it's much easier to make a $20 billion contribution than, let's say, South Africa. Right, so based on their foreign currency reserves. Right, so so I think there's something very interesting. So, but first of all, is this idea that by looking at this BRICS Development Bank, it's an institutional microcosm for looking at many things. One of my old professors, my longtime professors at York University, used to talk about how if you look at the formation of international institutions, you can get a sense of the nature of world order and power dynamics in the world. And I think, so that's in that spirit that I kind of approach this presentation. And so the idea is that five main points about shared structural dynamics. So this is the, to what degree there's a shared agenda or common experience, which is bringing the BRICS together, these BRICS countries. One, I think a lot of people have talked about this shift in the balance of power in the world economy. And so this is not so new. We're all used to this talk now. The second is the emergence of not only China as a rising power, but a broader grouping of rising states. Jim O'Neill yesterday talked about that. Three, I think this is where we start getting at some things that are more specific and interesting about the BRICS Bank. That the BRICS Bank gives us a lens on the systemic need for medium and long-term development finance, especially large-scale investment projects such as infrastructure. Right? There seems to be a gap in the system that isn't being filled by global capital markets and isn't being filled by traditional donor, sources. And that there's a need to, but yet this type of infrastructure financing, investment, large scale, is needed to sustain the rise of these BRICS countries and other developing countries, which, if you look at Africa, for example, there's a number of countries that have been growing at 5% per year GDP. How to sustain the growth of these developing economies and moving forward. Number four, and this is linked to what we just talked about, the G20 coming out of the global financial crisis. It is talked about dealing with infrastructure in Working Group 3, the development working group of the G20 process. But I would suggest that it's failed to deliver. And they've made a number of commitments and promises, actually, pushed by the Asian countries and the BRICS on infrastructure. But it failed to deliver. And I'll talk about some of that as we move forward. And that failure of the G20 process has helped fuel the frustration. So it's not just the vote and kind of quota issues and who has how much voice. Failure to deliver on key areas of financing that is deemed necessary by the developing world. Right? So failure of the G20 process to date. The Australians, though, I think have heard this now. After 3 or 4 failed summits on this front. The Australians are picking, Turkey is picking this up, right? And then we'll see who comes next. I think Vladimir Putin also got some of this. He kind of heard this. The last thing is the idea that in the BRICS, though, not to overgeneralize about them. Of course, there are differences. But one thing, for example, that perhaps Jim O'Neill and I would differ on. Jim O'Neill, in a piece in Bloomberg, talked about how ultimately the lack of sameness between these BRICS countries in size and economy and what it means to contribute to really sets them apart. Others would talk about India as a democracy, Brazil as a democracy, others are not, this kind of thing. The lack of like-mindedness. I take the approach that those differences can be impediments to collective action, but actually can also, through clever diplomacy, can be complementary. And so it's this idea of difference doesn't have to play out as being inhibiting cooperation. Right? Difference can play out as complementarity too. Right? So that's where some of my own research has gone in that direction, but looking at the economic diplomacy. I'll go through some of this quickly. There are massive, I think, infrastructure finance needs. And this is where the BRICS Bank, there's a debate about what should the BRICS Bank be, what's its value added? What should it be doing? Right? It seems that the BRICS countries have put a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, and they've also flagged the word sustainable development. Right? And I don't know how far they've gotten on that front. My sense is Brazil's probably the champion on that front. Right? But the others are more interested in the infrastructure financing side of it. Right? And what I would say, though, is I think since coming out of global financial crisis, linked to some of the things that Wang Wang said, I think is that what is the appropriate or best practices as far as a development model? This is kind of up for debate right now. And I think what we're seeing with China and others kind of acting unilaterally or bilaterally infrastructure financing in Africa, Latin America, all around the world. There's a kind of return to fundamentals of sorts, right? Peter Evans, I was at a workshop in Brown, talked about, this in a way, this is a return to fundamentals. 1950s, 1960s, what we used to call development, right? What we're seeing with the BRICS. And so I think in that way, it's kind of interesting, right? But this idea that we have, I think, a growing appreciation that there's a large deficit in infrastructure investment in the development, in the developing world. And it's something that has been in East Asia, United States, others have relied on infrastructure financing. And yet there's major shortfalls in the system. And I won't go through all the statistics. If you look at Africa in detail, this is from the African Development Bank, only a third of the continent's rural population has access to roads. Less than 40% of Africans have electricity, 5% agriculture under irrigation, 34% of population improved sanitation, 65% clean water. So you can see the statistics, pretty clear what is needed out there on this front. And if you look at the aggregate numbers, they're quite something. The president of the African Development Bank talks about the need of at least 93 billion per year until 2020 to bring infrastructure in Africa on par with low and middle income countries in other regions. Right, so the need is clear, I think, clearly there, right? And so, and I won't go through it, but this is all like different. G24 Secretariat talks about 1.15 trillion per year needed in infrastructure to sustain the growth that we have seen coming out of in the developing world, because not everyone's been hit. Tony said yesterday, right? Not everyone's in crisis coming out of 08, 09. There are parts of the world that have actually done pretty well, sustain their growth. But the question going forward is how can you keep it going? The bulk of the financing often is still state budgets, private sources. Only per year is about 250 billion. Right? So you see this 1.5 trillion number. The BRICS, one estimate, how much are they contributing kind of on their own? 70 to 80 billion per year. A lot of that is China, and this may be an overestimate. Right? We don't know how much of this is committed versus delivered. Since the financial crisis, this is where it gets interesting. Got a bit of a before and after picture with the global financial crisis. Right? So in other words, the needs are there before the global financial crisis, but there's an intensification since the crisis of need, in the sense that private finance for infrastructure has fallen sharply since 08, 09. European banks have undergone major deleveraging, right, which has reduced potentially their lending capacity further in this area. Basel III capital requirements, which we all are looking for financial stability, but potentially will cut further into financing for infrastructure. Private bank financing is reportedly 1/3 of the amount it was before the financial crisis. So traditional debt financing is no longer as viable an option as even if it was limited before for African countries, now even more so, arguably. Right? Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, around 75 trillion, but almost none goes to infrastructure. It's so-called bankable projects. It's very difficult because they need to see returns fairly rapidly. And we're talking 10, 15, 20-year investments. Right, so the World Bank is working with the Singaporeans now to try to marshal Asian bond markets, help grow them, and direct them towards these kind of bankable projects. It's not so easy to do these capital markets. And this is something that's been recognized, OECD, World Economic Forum, they have papers on this. And so it's very interesting. Official bilateral assistance, the bilateral donors have gotten out of infrastructure, right? They're focused on education, right? Poverty, so-called pro-poor growth strategies, health, social development. Somewhat now the World Bank is trying to get back into infrastructure because it sees the BRICS and others doing it and losing ground and may eventually lose further ground. So there's a concern. World Bank also limited. So, and especially for greenfield projects. Something about the G20 process. So G20 Seoul Summit, November 2010, right? Where the Asians are the first time hosting the G20 Summit. Right? So the first two summits, right? Washington, London, then Seoul. Here, the Koreans did a lot of work before the summit, and they introduced a number of what they call Seoul Development Declaration. Right? They tried to introduce new thinking, at least the idea that there isn't one size fits all. Right? In other words, challenging a little bit of the so-called Washington Consensus idea, the thinking, right? And really putting infrastructure was the first item on the Seoul Development agenda. And a number of promises were made. And this was backed by China, the BRICS, East Asian countries, obviously looking at their own experience. They saw the importance of infrastructure. But then you look at Cannes, G20, right? Nicolas Sarkozy shifts the attention to private donors, right? Bill Gates, he puts on the platform, right? Health, which is all good. But you can see it's a diversion from, this kind of agenda. Los Cabos, where the Mexican hosts are already looked at with suspicion by the BRICS as perhaps leaning too close to Washington. And they follow Sarkozy's agenda, private sources, right, of health, and they kind of kick infrastructure to the business 20 discussion, right? Leave it to the business people to talk about this. It's a little bit kicking the can to each other. When the Africans, this is, Chinese officials have told me when I met with them, Chinese Foreign Ministry, those who helped the Sherpa prepare, the Chinese Sherpa prepare for G20. They told me that when the African officials went to the World Bank after the instructions from the Seoul G20, right, that the World Bank, the MDBs, regional banks should increase the amount of lending to them on infrastructure, help get some stuff going. Right? We need to stimulate growth coming out of the crisis. When the Africans actually went to the World Bank, they were told, you got to improve your investment environment, go back to global capital markets. Right? It's kind of the same line as before. And the African officials said, it's actually gotten even more difficult to raise capital since the global market. And you're telling it, like, we knew that your advice before, right? And so what you see is this kind of very difficult to shift the thinking in these big global institutions. And so the Chinese were very aware of that. But let me just say a couple of things about contestation before I move on. Obviously, it's not all a happy story between the BRICS. Okay, thanks, Matthew. Brazil, India, China on environment, they're not necessarily all singing from the same hymn book, even though under Lula, it's amazing that they actually got together and formed a, kind of coherent position together on this. Bilateral trade tensions, we know about these, Brazil, India, China, have to trade imbalances. There's also intra-regional competition, right? Russia, China, Central Asia, and you have China, India, South Asia, Southeast Asia. Also with South Africa, there's complicated dynamics when China goes into Africa, right? Are they undercutting South African influence? And so there's a lot of issues there for them to work out. I mentioned some of these issues and some of this contestation then plays out diplomatically in the discussion about where to put the headquarters, staffing questions, right? Within the actual BRICS Bank discussions and negotiations themselves. China's interest, and I'll try to wrap up here, Matthew. Why is China interested in the BRICS Bank? I think there's a number of material needs. One, China needs to open avenues for its engineering and construction companies, right? Stimulate job creation, redirect a portion of its massive foreign currency reserves to productive purposes, right? Not just keep buying more US Treasury, and dollar-denominated assets, right? So how to shift a lot of, create an avenue shift into the real economy. Strategic. For China, there's a long view on this BRICS Development Bank. This is part of how to help drive sustained and stable growth in the developing world and create new markets for China beyond the traditional consumers of last resort. So the diversification agenda that China is now pursuing as far as trade and investment. Diplomatically, so this issue of the massive reserves, by reducing the reserves, hopefully can further help reduce some of the heat from the major deficit countries that China faces. Also, offset the influence of the World Bank and some of the other MDBs. Right? And China, as William already mentioned, is finding it very difficult. I'm happy in Q&A to talk about it more. Very difficult to reform the Bretton Woods system. And it's not so easy, not so straightforward. And they've been trying for the last couple of years, together with their BRIC allies, and it's not turned out so well for them so far. But also, there's a convergence with financial monetary influence. China is now interested in beginning to internationalize its currency and increase its use internationally. The China Development Bank, which calls itself the largest development bank in the world, much bigger than the World Bank, and China Exim Bank actually deliver a lot of the direct financing for these projects, for infrastructure. Right? And the CDB has been one of the key actors in helping to, on the Chinese side, get the BRICS Bank going. Chen Yuan, the former chairman or president of the China Development Bank, there's been a lot of talk of his role in helping to kind of launch this BRICS Bank. And he had a lot of experience, and there's this China Development Bank point. I think John will also touch on China Development Bank, right? And we'll more than touch on it. So I think in that way, this BRICS Bank also provides a platform for these countries, BRICS nations, to experiment with currency use with each other, intra-BRICS currency use. Right? Now, there's a lot of issues about also discussion whether the BRICS should launch BRICS bonds, right? Create new currency. And so this is Chen Yuan, and I don't have the time to go into it now, but you can see where he's been involved from Sanya, he's been involved, he attends every single one of these BRICS leaders summits with the other national bank, development bank representatives from the other BRICS countries, and they work things out. And so the pledges that he's made. The challenges, and I'll just end off here, for China this is really challenging. For each move it makes, right, this is the kind of perception of the BRICS Bank. And, is that, like the reality, and Jim O'Neill has talked about this too, is that 10 billion contribution from China is less than 1% GDP, and it's 2.5% GDP for South Africa. So there's a kind of unavoidable reality that China is just that much larger than its other partners economically. So any move China makes can kind of scare its partners in this initiative. And also there's the reality that the China-US relationship, the other members of the BRICS understand now, maybe not initially when they start, understand now that China has to get its relationship with the US quote unquote right. Doesn't mean it's always going to be peaceful and harmonious, but cannot let it go to like war, right? So this is where the other BRICS members are now trying to figure out how do they work with China in such a way that, there's certain things that they can't push China on too far, but it's thinking, vis-a-vis the United States, but how to work with China on this. And so I think, and China's figuring this out. Wang Yong talked about other options though. If this doesn't work, right, because there's some hesitation from the Indians, my understanding is maybe getting a little bit wet feet on this BRICS Bank, concerned China's getting too much influence. China's now also pursuing other options, and Wang Yong talked about them, and I'm happy to talk about them further. So let me just maybe end there. It'll be interesting, I think, to see at the Brazilian summit coming up, following the World Cup, at the end of the World Cup. My understanding is a lot of pressure being put on, between the BRICS themselves to have some deliverables. They need something major to announce. I think everyone's waiting for a breakthrough on this BRICS Development Bank. And I think they realize it's hard for Dilma Rousseff, she's facing a lot of trouble on the streets, and so it's not easy. But I think at this point, they've got to kind of do something serious. So I wouldn't be surprised if we hear 100 billion in the next couple of weeks, and even some other breakthroughs. Maybe not the headquarters solution yet. They might do some lending and see how it goes, make sure it goes well, and then leave the headquarters debate till a little later. But I think, we're gonna see them maybe even announce some loans for this new, like the first tranche of loans. Right, get it going, make sure it's successful, right? You don't wanna have it fall on its face, and then move forward. If they can do it, it's a bit of a game-changing moment. Thank you.